tell you a little bit about our work. We're an interdisciplinary research lab. Most of my work falls into that high-level strategic policy engagement and legal work side. We're probably most well known for our work on targeted threats and internet filtering and surveillance. But really, we're interested in how technology is rearranging relationships of power. When I explain this to my mom, I call it science fiction law. So I'll talk a little bit about the privacy issues, as well as the issue of algorithmic bias, so it's a bit of a double feature. Cool. So it should go without saying that these types of technologies generally require the collection and analysis of really vast amounts of personal data, and that comes with obvious risks, whether economic or social or political or ethical. Our Constitution protects information and places and things in which you have a reasonable expectation of privacy from state intrusion. That's the language of the law. Privacy laws limit how governments collect and use personal information, and private sector legislation limits how private companies can do so. Where private companies are providing services to government or technologies to government, they sort of have to play by government rules, more or less. In AI systems, there's going to be really important privacy limits on what data can be used and how that apply both to input as well as output data, and I think this is an important thing to keep in mind. In some cases, there was a subtext of the conversation this morning, maybe these are going to seem like really pesky limitations on innovation, but in many cases they're also going to be critical guarantors of fundamentally protected human rights and freedoms. So what I want you to take away from this privacy issue is that both types of data, both, for example, training data or input data and outputs, can have a privacy interest, a legal privacy interest in them, but that interest may not be of the same degree or the same nature or the same type in terms of intimacy or invasiveness. So for example, I can take a number of variables that you're likely to have a low privacy interest in, legally speaking, or that might seem innocuous at first glance, but an algorithm can sort of combine them and make inferences that ultimately determine very intimate details about your life. So for example, your sexual habits, your political ideas, whether you're cheating on your spouse, whether or not you're going to church. So when talking about AI and privacy, we need to keep both of these moving parts in mind. I also want to highlight that, as mentioned this morning, AI can be used to predict cybersecurity risks, but it can also be used to create them, to find and exploit new vulnerabilities in technology, to develop new forms of malware, to reverse engineer security systems, to carry out physical attacks. So when we're talking about privacy, we also need to think through the cybersecurity engineering problems in really significant detail. I do want to talk about this issue of consent. I think I may be a little bit anomalous in the privacy community, but I think that it's important to say that user consent is probably the wrong framework for understanding privacy and data in this context, for the same reasons that data ownership is the wrong framework. The implications and the effects of these types of systems are often far too complex for individuals to evaluate them as a meaningful dimension of consumer choice. The consent model is individualistic, transactional, contractual, and it's really only adequate if we want to think about data as a commodity that we give and take, rather than as embedded with rights that we have. So instead, I think it might be helpful for policymakers to think about privacy as a public good. There's a big literature around this, but thinking about privacy as a public good, like clean drinking water or a functional healthcare system, might be a more robust framework. It's important to understand that privacy not only facilitates consumer trust and market innovation, but it's also a guarantor of other rights like freedom of expression and opinion. We need private spaces to experiment with who we are and what we believe. And it's also a critical dimension of democratic participation. So I think the Cambridge Analytica story, for example, really highlights that a lack of privacy can be used to subvert these kinds of democratic norms in a pretty profound sense, and helps us map the relationship between privacy and political security. So mass data collection and mass predictive analysis also facilitates manipulation and persuasion and political profiling. So here's this bias piece, right? I think it's important to understand that these are not two separate topics, that privacy, equality, surveillance, and bias are all intrinsically interlinked issues. And certain groups, in Canada, those groups include people of color, Indigenous people, poor people are going to be disproportionately subject to state scrutiny and also suffer disproportionate consequences as a result. So what people in my field tend to call function creep is a really critical issue here. So depending on who you are in the world or where in the life cycle of product you are, technological change is going to impact you differently. And technology that's adopted for one purpose, like traffic monitoring or something like that, can really easily be repurposed for more dystopian applications, like predictive policing, for example, or surveillance of social movements or public gatherings. I think if I could say something to policymakers, it's really important to understand that the shiny promotional material about how AI will get rolled out in helping sick kids or revolutionizing teaching, that doesn't tell you a lot about how these technologies will ultimately be used in refugee camps or immigration detention centers or prisons. And they will be used in those applications too. So when talking about bias, we often say, garbage in, garbage out. If your training or your input data is incomplete or reflects pre-existing forms of discrimination or bias, the outputs are going to render in a way that reflects those inadequacies, and in some cases will exacerbate it. So in a world where policy decisions are really increasingly data-driven, what counts and who counts and how those people are counted really matters. So if facial recognition systems are predominantly trained on images of white people, they will be better at recognizing white people, which might mean that when that technology is rolled out into automated vehicles, white people are less likely to get hit by them. And that's a problem. Historically, medical studies have overwhelmingly used healthy males for research purposes. So what does that mean for women's access to healthcare? We also have the inverse problem, right? So some individuals in some communities are given disproportionate attention and prejudicial attention by the state. And that's clear in the context of policing, very obviously, where people of color and Indigenous people and people with mental health issues are disproportionately represented. But it can also be a bit more subtle, I think. And then where these technologies have a predictive dimension, they risk not only reproducing, but also reinforcing systemic forms of discrimination. And they can kind of create technological self-fulfilling prophecies and a false path dependency that we have, that we may think of as logical or as scientific just because an algorithm did it. So if a system, for example, instructs you to dispatch more police in a given geographic area, you are more likely to charge more people with criminal offenses in that area, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that people in that area are more likely to be criminals. It just means that they're more likely to get caught being criminals. So we have to be careful about the types of inferences that we draw from these types of systems. And I think that there's also a risk of an individualizing effect in terms of thinking about collective goods that might resonate with some people in the room. Alistair Crowell writes about this. He says, our social safety net is woven on uncertainty. The better we are at predicting the future, the less likely we'll be willing to share our fates with others. And that's bad for public service delivery. It's bad for values like equality. It's ultimately potentially a democratic threat. So anyone who tells you that this problem of algorithmic bias is easy to solve, whether technologically or at the policy level, is lying, I think. And part of the reason it's so challenging is because at the level of political and social norms, we don't always agree. So for example, we don't have a universal idea of what fairness means. That's contextual, it's ideological, it's political. And designing fair systems requires having difficult conversations about what we mean in the first place, both about fair process and about fair outcomes. And then creating frameworks to test and optimize for those types of outcomes, which is an engineering problem as much as it is a resource and policy one. And I think it's an unpopular thing to say, but it also requires recognizing that the current political and policy infrastructure we have in place for solving these types of issues is in many cases very, very broken. Bias is one of the fundamental reasons for the right to explanation in the GDPR, which we can talk about a bit. But that kind of algorithmic explanation is not likely to be a technological possibility where there are more complex forms of artificial intelligence involved. So we're going to have to start asking questions like, do we test for these kinds of issues retroactively, or do we decide that there are just some sorts of decisions that we don't let machines make? And all of that is complicated by this other question, right? So for example, in the case of criminal sentencing algorithms like the Compass system, which I think was in the background materials for today, there's a question like, what if we can make a sentencing algorithm that still returns racially biased outcomes, but they're less racist than your average judge? How do public policy thinkers solve that problem, right? And I guess I'm particularly concerned, I was so interested to hear you talk about this this morning, but I'm particularly concerned about applications of these technologies in government decision making where there are gaps in charter protections and constitutional protections. So for example, where there are issues of economic inequality at play, where there's not a clear sort of charter analysis that we can do, as well as where there's a high level of discretion afforded to administrative decision makers, but where the rights of individuals can be very seriously impacted. So immigration law, where someone may end up being deported or put into immigration detention on the basis of a reasonableness standard of review is one example of that. So I guess finally, I want to make a sort of meta comment about both the privacy and bias issues, about how we define policy problems in the first place. I'm not in government, but I would comment that sometimes new and shiny technologies pull policymakers away from their core mandate in very strange ways. I've been calling this getting monorailed recently. So it's sort of like the policy problem shifts altogether, right? So what you're solving for is no longer like, how do we provide excellent healthcare, or how do we improve public safety, but instead, how do we use this cool, shiny new technology? And that's the wrong problem to solve for. And I've been noticing that some of the most problematic outcomes in terms of privacy or bias or other types of human rights issues really seem to crop up when we're solving for the wrong problem and when we're not honest and intentional about the types of values that are informing our work. We often get so excited about doing something that we don't stop and ask if we should or how we should. So I think that there are some problems in government that AI is going to be very well suited to solve. There are others that it's not going to be, or maybe not yet. And there are some decisions that for legal or for ethical reasons, we might always want a human to make, even if they're worse. Even if they're worse than your average machine-generated decision. And more than that, there's going to be a whole sort of constellation of problems that are just going to take some really deep, humble, critical introspection about how our current systems are not working before AI can offer a meaningful and appropriate technological solution. So to get it right, I think we have to understand the difference. Yeah, and I think that's time. Thanks.